Hi everybody, Mike from the Digital Media Lab here today to talk to you guys about sharpening inside of Adobe Photoshop CC 2015. Now I am working on a Mac and Adobe Photoshop CC 2015, but this will work in most versions of Photoshop that I can think of, although I think Smart Sharpen may have gotten a little bit of an overhaul in the recent version. But let's get started. First off, when we want to understand sharpening, we really want to understand what it really is inside of an image. And really, when we think about sharpening, when we think about lines, they don't really exist in the real world, but in an image, they're areas where a line is essentially an area where the contrast has changed dramatically, right? From Britney's hair to the sky, the contrast, and we essentially have a line kind of tracing out her hair, right? And we can sharpen those lines. Let's take a look at what sharpening is before we get into sharpening an actual image. So let's go to File, New, and create a new document. And I'm going to go ahead and call this Sharpen Practice. And a width of 11 is fine. Let's go ahead and create a 10-inch by 10-inch document. The resolution's not terribly important, but let's go ahead and leave it at 300. So 10 inches width, 10 inches height, and a resolution of 300, and leave all the other settings at the default. I'll go ahead and click OK to create that document, and we have our document. The very first thing I need to do is grab my rectangular marquee tool, and I want to change my style from normal to fixed size. We want to create a selection of half of our document, and I'm going to select a width of 10 inches, and a height of half our document, which is 5 inches. I'll type IN just to be sure that I'm in inches. So a width of 10 inches and a height of 5 inches. And I'll just click and it will automatically create a selection there. You may need to drag it up and it should snap just like so. From here, I need to grab my gradient tool and I need to select the gradient that's there by default. If you click this little fly down arrow, it is the very first gradient at the very top left. And I'll click the very edge of the document. And I'll click and drag over to the very other end of the document. If I hold down the Shift key, it will constrain that to a 90-degree angle, or in this case, a straight line. And we can see I've created a line from white to black. If you have a line from black to white, that's okay too. I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee tool once again and click and drag my selection down. It should snap into place. And we're going to create a gradient going the opposite direction. So I'll grab my gradient tool and simply do the exact same steps, clicking on the very edge of the document, holding down the Shift key and drag the opposite direction. If for some reason you're seeing a gradient of a different type, make sure you have white as your foreground and black as your background, and you have a linear gradient selected. I'll go ahead and press Command D to deselect. That'll remove that selection. And what we have here is we have a line that is essentially contrasting in different directions. So it's becoming a more of a line, if you want to think of it that way, as we get to the very edge, and then kind of less of a line. And then somewhere in the very center here, there's actually no line whatsoever. So let's see how sharpening behaves when we sharpen this line. I'm going to go ahead and press Command J to make a duplicate of the background layer. And let's call this layer Smart Sharpen. From here, I need to go to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. And with the preview checkbox checked, I'll zoom in by pressing Command plus a few times. We can really start to see what sharpening actually is. I'll drag my amount just to kind of over-accentuate that. And we can see exactly what sharpening is. It's sort of increasing the contrast of that line. It's making the dark side darker and the light side lighter. That's contrast. Making the whites whiter, making the darks darker. So essentially sharpening inside of Photoshop, or sharpening a pixel-based image, is taking the image and making the contrast greater where those lines are. And the amount is what you think it is. It's kind of how hard it hits it with this. And you'll notice that there's also a radius value where it's sort of how much from that line do you want to create that contrast. And this is usually determined by the resolution of the image and also kind of set to taste, what you like and what you think it should look like. There's also another aspect to sharpening I really want to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and select this reduce noise option to vary it to 0. and set my amount to 500% just to kind of over exaggerate this. And we start to see an issue. Now, I created a black and white image inside of Photoshop, and I created this image myself. And yet we start to see these variations inside of what we created here. All images, no matter what, contain at least a little bit of noise. Now I'm hitting it with some really high amount of sharpening settings to kind of accentuate that noise. And there's color in here, so there's color noise as well as contrast noise. But whenever you sharpen, you also have the problem that if there's noise in that image, and there's always going to be noise in that image, that when you sharpen, you're also going to sharpen the noise as well as the kinds of lines that you want. So they give you this reduce noise option to allow you to kind of bring it down a little bit. So whenever you're sharpening, you're also increasing the amount of noise, which is also why you want to reduce the noise in your image first and then sharpen. You'll notice that there are some other settings in here. You always want to leave it to lens blur. There is a motion blur filter option. It doesn't work. We're going to get to that in just a second. I'll go ahead and click OK, and we can kind of see what that sharpening does. I'm going to go ahead and hide that layer, select the background layer, and press Command J to make a new duplicate of our background. I'm going to double click the name itself and rename it. We're going to call this High Pass, and I'm going to show you one other way to sharpen an image. So I'm going to go to Filter, Other, High Pass. And we get just a radius value. And this is exactly like our radius value before. So if I set a similar value, I don't quite remember what I had before, I'll click OK. And yet we don't quite get the sort of imagery that we want, right? This looks like a muddy mess. It's not really our image, but we do see that it has kind of increased this contrast. What we need to do is change this layer from normal to overlay. And you can actually use any of the contrast blend modes. All of the contrast blend modes are set together here in this section. These are all the darken blend modes, these are all the brighten blend modes, and these are all the contrast blend modes. So if I set it, typically soft light is a very good setting, and I can kind of show and hide, and we can see that it's increased the contrast of that line. And if I need to, you can try different settings in here. These are going to kind of hit it at different degrees. And we're going to take a look at this in a real image in just a second. And you can also reduce the opacity if you feel like if one of these settings still looks pretty good, but you need to reduce the opacity a little bit. Let's look at how to apply these with smart filters, which is the preferred option. And incidentally, if you're taking 2350 and you're watching this class, please submit them with smart filters. It's a lot easier for us to see what you have done inside of Photoshop. Let's take a look at a real image. Now remember, a smart filter is simply like a container, right? So the original image that I had, that I took in here, is actually just contained within here. And I've applied some high pass sharpening, but let's see exactly what I did by drilling down to the original image. And I can do that by simply double clicking the thumbnail. And I might actually have a smart object inside of a smart object. I don't recommend that you do that. Nope, it's still here. And I'm going to go ahead and hide all of these layers so that we can kind of work with the original image that I had here. As before, I'm going to use high pass sharpening. You could also use smart sharpening in the same method. If you have a bunch of edits done to your image like I have here, and you want to apply some sharpening, what you can do is select the very top layer, so essentially all of the modifier keys. So that's on the Mac, Shift, Option, Command. On the PC, it's Shift, Alt, Control, and the E key. And that will create a stamp visible layer of everything I've done here. And typically you want sharpening to be the last step in your process, because usually you sharpen based on output. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So from here, I need to create it as a smart object. I can go to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters. And then here, once it's a smart filter, once it's a smart object, I can tell because it has that little icon there. And I'll go to Filter, Sharpen. You could select Smart Sharpen. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how to do this in High Pass. So I'll select high pass, and usually you want to set a radius value fairly low. It's going to be dependent on the image and some personal taste, and there are some kind of interesting techniques when you apply very, very high radius sharpenings, but for standard sharpening, you want the image just barely be visible. If you over sharpen an image, you're really going to cause yourself a lot of problems. The image is going to look very crispy. You can cause halos where the sharpening kind of expands beyond certain lines and things like that. For this image, I'm going to set a radius value of about 2.8, and I'll click OK. And of course, we have a smart object, but we can't set the value. So what you need to do is click this little icon right here. It looks like it's very, very tiny. If you double click that icon, you can actually set the blending options for the smart filter itself. So if I select something like overlay, and I can also adjust the opacity of just the filter itself. This is very, very handy. I can apply a layer mask, so if there are certain areas of the image that I don't care to sharpen, I can go ahead and paint out those areas where I don't want sharpening. It's just a tiny, tiny little bit. It's not something you really hit it too hard. It's just a little nudge there to make things just a tiny, tiny bit sharpening. So here's it off, here's it on. And likewise, if you were going to apply this using Smart Sharpen, I did want to show you one quick thing. One advantage of using Smart Sharpen is we can actually fix one small problem. And I'll go ahead and set some typical settings here real fast. Let's try. I'm going to hit it a little hard here. I know that YouTube might compress this a little bit. There we go. I'm over sharpening a little bit, and you can always tell if you're over sharpening because, and let me zoom in here. You'll get like very odd highlights here, and you'll get haloing around your image. Sometimes that's okay, depending on how far away the person is going to be viewing this and what medium they're going to be viewing it in. But one thing you never ever want to do is you want to try to avoid sharpening color. There's actually a really easy way to fix that. You remember that when we sharpened earlier, we saw that a bunch of colors came out and we had color noise happening in the image. We want to avoid at least that type of color noise coming out, and we can solve it very, very simply by changing the blending modes just as before by clicking this double clicking this icon right here and changing the mode from normal to luminosity. Luminosity will only affect the brightness and contrast, and you may not even notice a difference. It's going to be very, very subtle. And likewise as before, I can change the smart filters and those options like that. One more thing to talk about as we've learned about sharpening, you may have noticed that we're going to increase line contrast as we talked about just a second ago. Now, when you have a blurry image, I think most of us already know the answer to this, but when I try and sharpen a blurry image, I'm not going to be able to fix the image. Sharpening is not something that really fixes things. It's almost an illusion. It's not really doing anything to the image except for creating a little bit more contrast within those lines, which sort of tricks our eyes into thinking it's sharper than it actually is. So I'll go ahead and convert this to a smart filter and apply sharpening. And I think everyone here is going to be able to tell that, of course, like, this isn't going to do anything. Even if I really, really hit it very, very hard, I'm not going to be able to fix this image with sharpening. So it's important in any of your images inside of Photoshop that you start with good work to begin with and then give it that little tiny little nudge. You don't want to overhit it with sharpening, and you want it to also be your last step, because if it's your last step, then you can think about what medium is this going to be in. If it's going to be for your screen, if it's going to be for the monitor or projector or something like that, you really want to hit it with just the tiniest amount of sharpening. Screens don't need a lot. But then there are various types of printing. Whether or not you're printing on coated paper or uncoated paper is going to affect how much sharpening you need. If you're printing on uncoated paper, you're going to need a little bit more. If you're printing on matte or coated paper, maybe just a little bit less. And then printing is going to need a little bit more sharpening than either of those. When I worked at the Houston Chronicle, we used the worst paper on the cheapest method of printing possible, and we had to really, really hammer it with sharpening. I promise you, it looked really bad on the screen. We really just took these settings to the maximum, and when we did that, and when it actually it looked terrible on the screen, but when we printed it out, it looked good because we sharpened for output. I'm Mike D. This has been Sharpening for Photoshop.